My name is Wesley Crump. I'm new here as of a month. New here as a county horticulturist, and I'm over Wasatch and Summit counties. And I was excited to receive this invitation to present today. And I learned a lot in that presentation or in that research process. And I'm excited to share, as my subtitle suggests, some of the why and also how of crop rotation. A lot of that was learned, especially the how and how to make that a productive system in Utah on the urban micro farm scale. That was learned in talking to some farmers and those that are having their hands in the soils. So I'm excited to share some of these thoughts. So to start out, just a brief outline. I'd like to start with a working definition so we're all on the same page, then get into some of the benefits of rotation, some of the methods of how you can think about that, and there are many, then some of the challenges that are faced, especially those specific to a small scale, this urban, this micro farming, how some farmers in Utah are working through those challenges, and then offer up some resources at the end for further explanation and exploration. So starting off with some definitions, very basic definition, crop rotation here at the beginning refers to the sequencing of crops over time on a field or planting bed. Adding on to that definition is another that says it involves rotating the plants of different crops, each with different nutritional needs in succession in the same space. So adding to that first definition is this idea that different crops have different nutritional needs. Now expanding on those, this last definition I'll offer here is that rotation is the practice of using the natural biological and physical properties of crops to benefit the growth, health, and competitive advantage of other crops. In this process, the soil and its life are also benefited. The desired result is a farm which is more productive and to a greater extent self-reliant. So this definition starts to get into some of the whys of crop rotation, some of those benefits. So this idea of using crops and the unique intrinsic values of each crops to benefit those that are coming after it in succession. And also this idea of bringing in the soil and its health and how crop rotation can be beneficial to that soil health. Now attaching to those definitions is just, I want to give this very rudimentary, cartoonish visual definition of a crop rotation. So it's split into 4 years, and you have in this given field or growing space 4 different plots with 4 different crops, and each year you can see that those are rotating. And again, this is very basic, and we'll talk more about this as we go, but just want to offer this again to give the foundational idea of what crop rotation at its most fundamental can look like. So getting into the why of crop rotation, largely and broadly going to split this into 2 groups, 2 benefits. And one is to improve and maintain soil health, and the second is to manage diseases and pests. And so I'd like to now get into some of the specifics on those 2 broad categories. So first, crop rotation is important and can really help in maintaining the adequate nutrient levels in the soil. And so in earlier sessions, we've talked about the soil as a bank, and that can be for water. Here, I'll refer to it as kind of nutrient bank that is housed within that soil. So when we harvest crops, we take them out of that system, we're making withdrawals from that bank. As I mentioned earlier, each plant or groups of plants has somewhat specific nutrient needs. So I'm showing here this table that is lifted from a resource that I'll be referring to often. It's provided by SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, and their publication that was called Crop Rotation on Organic Farms. And it's a planning manual, and it applies to all farms, conventional or organic. So, and this just shows in really broad strokes, grouping together of crops according to their relative nutrient requirements. And so as we understand this, and we can rotate our crops according to these nutrient levels so that we're not making withdrawals from that nutrient bank repeatedly and depleting it so that soil cannot provide a sustained production in later years. Can also help with fertilizer use. And when we're thinking about maintaining that nutrient level and making deposits back in, So Grant just talked a lot about fertilization, and so this can be done with crop rotation through the incorporation of cover crops, particularly legumes, like was mentioned, as we can make those deposits back into that soil bank. Another improvement that we can make through crop rotation is to maintain, again, that organic matter that Grant was just talking about as well. I've shown here this image, or this cartoon again, of a soil aggregate. So organic matter that we can improve through crop rotation is important for that aggregate formation. It's also really important as we think about the extended growth season that we can achieve through crop rotation. As we cycle through cool and warm and maybe some shoulder season crops, we can expand that time that living roots are in the soil through that crop rotation. And again, this contributes to that soil organic matter levels. A topic that's currently undergoing a lot of research is the idea of this living fraction of the soil. And so crop rotation can diversify and strengthen the microbiome in the soil. So there's been research that has shown it can increase the total biomass as well as the diversity of that microbiome. It's been shown that different rotations can have different profiles, and some of those can be potentially helpful, and we'll talk more about this in just a bit, in decreasing harmful pathogens within the soil and promoting those beneficial microbes. Last thing I'll touch on, and this relates to that organic matter again, is the physical condition of the soil that can be improved through crop rotation. So again, this aggregate formation that's very important in the water infiltration, in the aeration of the soil. In addition, as you rotate in root crops such as tiller radishes and such, you can help with that physical compaction of the soil to prevent that and keep the soil in good condition. I want to talk about now the benefit of rotating crops to manage pests and diseases. So the general idea here is that crop rotation can aid in reducing the accumulation of those pathogens to a given crop. Now, of course, pathogens, the microbiome of the soil is so complex, and pathogens are almost always going to be there. But the idea here is that through crop rotation, you can reduce the accumulation of those pathogens to the point where it's not economically detrimental to your operation. So I want to share this quote again. This is from that same publication. It says, "To manage a disease successfully with rotation, one needs to know how long the pathogen can survive in the soil, which additional plant species it can infect or survive on, other ways it can survive, how it can be spread or reintroduced, and other methods for managing the other pathogen sources." I think this is very informative, and as you bump up against certain pathogens and you learn in detail about their life cycles and their host, whether they're host specific or how they can survive, this can really be integrated into your crop rotation to more successfully manage for pests and diseases. But I do want to issue a caveat that I think you can be successful with crop rotation without knowing all of these details for every pest or pathogen you'll encounter. But as you do learn those and incorporate that into your rotation, you can gain even added benefits. I wanted to offer up some examples of both of these I think are bacterial that can be really effectively managed through crop rotation. So this first is bacterial spot in peppers and tomatoes. And so this, it's helpful with crop rotation because you're moving those crops. And so bacterial spot, it can't survive after that plant debris has decomposed. So that can be effectively managed through that crop rotation. Another example is bacterial speck. Again, this in tomato, and it's the same idea. As that plant debris is removed or as it decomposes, this bacteria cannot last without that host. Now, it's important to note that a lot of pathogens are more difficult to manage maybe completely with crop rotation because for several reasons. They can be very long-lived within that soil, and they can also subsist on any organic matter, so they're not host specific. So some examples of that are Pythium and Fusarium rhizoctonium, Erwinia, other just really long-lived pathogens. In their life cycle, they can essentially go dormant. You have Phytophthora and Verticillium, and I know this can be kind of disheartening because these are a lot of the issues that we deal with, but I think it's important to remember that all is not lost. And one topic that I think is very interesting, and again, there's a lot of research going on currently, is the idea of biofumigation. So the crops that have inhibitory action on pathogens. So there's lots of research. I'm just showing some examples here, but it was shown broccoli and other mustards were lowering pressure of verticillium wilt. And that was due to some of their secondary defensive compounds that they're exuding. Hairy vetch was shown to lower fusarium wilt in watermelon that was grown after it, and sunflower that was rotated in before maize was lowering a fusarium species. And then looking specifically, there was a study looking at cucumber production, and the rotation of cabbage and kidney beans as well as celery, all were lowering a specific pathogen to it. So again, I cannot cover everything, but my advice would be, if you're dealing historically with a specific pathogen, to dive into the literature and to look if there are potentially beneficial crop rotations out there. Now, thinking about insect pests, again, it's the same idea as that crop rotation can reduce the population buildup of these pests. And this, again, is because you're making the food source more difficult to find, or you might be disrupting the life or the feeding cycles. And increased mobility of the pest, of course, makes it more difficult to control completely. But again, some pests, here I'm offering the example of western corn rootworm, can be really effectively fought against or deterred through crop rotation. So this is because the larva of the western corn rootworm can only survive in great number when that corn root is available. And so this really wasn't an issue until intensive corn planting started to happen. But as you implement that crop rotation, you can really keep a balance on that. Thinking of the other pests in our lives, the weeds. So crop rotation can also aid in weed control. As we know, different weeds have different germination times, and as you're rotating through crops, especially as you take advantage of the wide growing season and grow cool season crops, as well as the warm season and some shoulder season crops, you can have that ground covered, and this can disrupt the weed germination and establishment cycle. Also, as you think about the different crops that you're cycling through, you can rotate crops with varying degrees of competitiveness. So something like onions that aren't very competitive with weeds, you maybe can grow after a crop that is more competitive, that has a fuller canopy planted densely, if you're thinking about maybe potatoes or something that can keep the weeds at bay after, and then you can rotate in one that's not as competitive. And again, another plug for cover crops. As you keep that soil covered, this can again aid in the weed management. I want to now again revisit this and transition a little bit into some of these crop rotation methods. And so again, this is very simplistic, only growing four crops in this scenario, and you're just simply rotating those through. And this could be applicable to your situation. Often in the microfarm, you're growing a vast array. There's lots of diversity of crops, so it'll be more complex than this. But there are some general kind of foundational principles and methods that can help you in thinking about how to implement crop rotation on your farm. So the most basic and fundamental is to move the crop, right? To rotate it. So don't grow the same crop in the same space in succession. And I say succession, it doesn't necessarily have to be year, like it was broken up in that last diagram. This can often be, because we're cycling through crops, multiple in any year. So the foundational would be not growing the same crop in the same space, planting after planting after planting. Now, maybe the most widely used and beneficial way of thinking about how to go about rotating crops is to rotate by botanical families. So I've listed here, some of the families that are commonly encountered, and these can be easily attained through a Google search or looking at a USU publication. But these often, they're helpful in thinking about it in terms of botanical families, because pests, diseases, conditions are also often grouped together as these botanical families suggest. And so by rotating according to family, you can be really effective in that rotation. I want to offer some additional ideas. You can do this on top of botanical families. Sometimes these are inherently included in that rotation, but they're also another way that you can think about it. So you can think about rotating nitrogen demanding as well as nitrogen giving or lighter feeders. And so again, revisiting this idea of the different relative nutrient requirements. So you can rotate, before a high demanding crop, you can rotate in a legume, and that can be very beneficial. Another way of thinking about it is rotate by root crops, by fruiting and leafy crops. So not having perpetually root crops in the same space, but intermixing those with fruiting crops as well as leafy crops. Another idea, and this was talked about by Dr. Dross this morning, the idea of crops with different root lengths, and this can help in several ways. One of which is being more efficient with your fertilizer use. So you have maybe something like potato, for example, that isn't as deeply rooted. And so that's going to mine nutrients in that specific soil profile, right? But then pumpkins growing that after have a much deeper rooted root system, and those can mine nutrients from a different layer within that soil profile. Said it a couple times, but cover crops, if you can include those in your rotation, there's some serious benefits for that. And this is often a challenge, and we'll address this in this small scale farming because you're trying to maximize your time and all that small amount of land. And then within beds, I've mentioned this before, but rotating crops with different growing times. So in the spring, cool season crops in the summer, having some fall sowings. This is another really effective rotation method. I want to address some of these challenges. So inherent in micro farming, in the name, it's a small space, right? And often micro farmers are growing a diverse number of crops. So these two things added together equal increased complexity when it comes to thinking about crop rotation plans. Often you'll have one or two or three, several crops that are your cash crops that really dominate the percentage of the total crops grown. And this can be difficult, again, to cycle in the space provided in your operation to not have repeated plantings of those same crops. Maybe you're growing a lot of different crops that are all closely related. So for example, lots of brassicas. Again, this can be difficult if you're thinking and you're trying specifically to do only by botanical families. This can be difficult to plan. Something that I'm aware of up here in Heber and Wasatch and Summit counties, the climate, right? And your management practices may dictate what you can grow where. So that's a definite challenge. The unexpected and unpredictable weather, as was mentioned in a couple talks earlier, this last year we had a really cool, wet spring, followed by a very hot, immediately dry summer. So these things, they definitely provide challenges for a lot of aspects, but one of those is in your crop rotation. What if you want to grow perennials, and how does that fit in? And then again, cover crops. How can I fit those in if you're trying to maximize that land and all the times that you can grow in that land? I was curious as to how people are dealing with this in Utah, specifically micro and urban farmers. So I was able to talk to a couple handful, not as many as I would like, but I was able to hear how they're dealing with these challenges, things that they've seen, and some observations. So I wanted to highlight some things that I heard that are in line with what I've been talking about, and really being creative in using crop rotation in an urban farm setting. So one thing that I heard from everyone that I talked to was that crop rotation was an integral practice for them. And so everyone was using it, and long, complex rotations can be very fruitful. I'm showing here a picture from that same publication from SARE, showing, these 4 years and 3 different farms on the top. And some of them are much more complex than others. They're splitting out their beds and they're doing different rotations. So these complex rotations can be really useful. But the one thing I'd like to drive home is any rotation is better than none. Whether that's the amount that you're using or the years, before you're revisiting the same bed, any rotation is better than none. One thing that I learned while talking to the different growers was that how you think about and plan your crop rotation and implement it will depend on your situation. So are you growing for a CSA? Often those who are growing for CSA mean translates into a wide variety of crops, right? So they have a lot of things to think about, and this will often necessitate you to spend some more time planning your crop rotation. Maybe you're trying to grow wholesale, and this doesn't necessarily have to be, but it could mean that you're growing fewer number of crops, but you need to grow more of them. And so this could, again, potentially be amenable to a simpler rotation as you think about how you want to implement that crop rotation. Farmers markets, this can be kind of all over the place. It can be a combination of CSA and wholesale. Your short growing season. So again, we'll talk about this, how people responded to this, but this definitely influences how much you can rotate and how you plan that. Now, are you growing organic? Are you certified organic? Are you adhering to those principles? Are you growing more conventional? That can influence kind of your approach to crop rotation. Are you rotating more to suppress pests, to suppress weeds? All those things can kind of play into how you plan out that rotation. Most of them, the answer was F, all of the above. They're dipping into all these different things. And so it definitely takes some methodical time and planning to implement crop rotation. And again, I just said it, plan it out. So this is something that everyone was doing. And if you can, have multiple contingency plans. I talked with one grower who they're relatively new on their land, and they said by the second or third week, they're on plan B, C, and D pretty quickly. But they have those plans, and so they're able to implement things. If for whatever reason something doesn't come up, what are you going to rotate into that spot? Having that plan and making sure you write it down, whether that's pen and paper. There was some growers who were just writing it down in a notebook. Most were using a Excel spreadsheet, and some were using other software. There's actually some, if you Google that can really help you plan that rotation. Right in line and in tandem with that is to keep records. So again, this grower that was new on their land would walk their farm every day and take notes. And this is something that you think you'll remember from year to year, but there's too many things to remember. So having that record of what was working, what didn't work, things that you observed that you really liked and want to repeat, that can really be worth their weight in gold. And it can be as simple as possible. So I myself am taking over my parents' rather large garden this year while they're away, and I asked my mom to put out how she planted it last year, and in chicken scratch, this is what she put. And this can be okay if this is all you have, and getting started, this is helpful. But keeping those records, again, can be really beneficial in continually learning and improving. Another thing that I probably learned the most was that you have to be creative. So some examples of that, a couple growers up here in Heber and in the Heber Valley wanting to grow tomatoes, but the only real way they could do that in a manner that made sense was to use high tunnel. And that meant they were growing in the same spot. And so if they had different beds within that high tunnel, they could rotate through that. They could also think about, again, utilizing cool season crops really early in the spring, then growing their tomatoes, and then trying to get in a cool season crop at the end. So bookending those tomatoes. And this way, again, you're implementing some of those crop rotation practices. Maybe at the end, they're including, one grower was starting to include a cover crop at the end of the season. And because of that season extension structure, you're able to get some growth to provide, again, some of those benefits. So the idea of cover crops is talked to James Loomis at Wasatch Community Gardens, Green Phoenix Farm. And one of the things that he talked about that he was implementing was undersowing. So he trained up his tomatoes and undersow a legume, a cover crop legume. And this, again, trying to utilize all the space as possible, but also trying to be wise stewards and implement these practices. This was something that was working for him. Again, another creative idea from James was that, if you've historically had issues, you can, if it's possible, if it fits within your schematic, you can take something out of rotation completely, right? So he said a lot of people had dealt with squash bugs last year and he didn't have any. And that was simply because he had taken squash out. So this is just an idea. If that's possible for you in your operation, you can keep that in mind. It's also important to think about what your goals are, and if those change, to not be afraid to make changes in your operation. So one grower, for example, had done the CSA, had done the farmers market, and was scaling back and was thinking about just one cash crop per bed, and being a little more simplistic. And in that way, could keep a better handle on their rotation. So being creative, I think, is really important. And lastly, would be to be flexible. So all things are going to happen. Springs are going to be cold. The summer's going to come in really hot. Droughts are a perpetual problem these days. The markets are going to change. So when you think about your rotation, when you're planning it out, when you're implementing it, when you're evaluating it, remember to be flexible, and having those plans and records can really be helpful with that. So I'd like now to just throw up this slide. Has a link to a link tree that has all of the references that I used in this presentation, and just wanted to again highlight this crop rotation planning manual. It has some really good in-depth examples of crop rotation, in-depth planning guides. There's some procedures. Doesn't tell you how to do it, but can guide you along, as well as some disease host references. So it's been a great reference, and I've learned a lot from that. So with that, I'll know there's probably only a minute or two, but happy to look at questions.
Thank you so much. So you've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. A reminder for everyone, CSA is community supported agriculture. So that's where someone buys a share of your farm and then they get a bag or a basket of food delivered to them throughout the growing season that you dictate. So if you're not familiar with that term, is there a good distance for standard crop rotation to effectively mitigate disease and pathogens? If I move my crops 1 30-inch bed over to the next, is that enough?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it's the most hated answer. It's really going to depend upon a lot of factors, but the crop, maybe the pathogen, the pest that you're hoping to kind of tamp down on with that rotation. Lots of these pests are more mobile, and so maybe that much isn't really going to help